Hello, so today we're talking about the novel Cabal by Clive Barker. It was originally published in 1988, and then it was adapted into a movie which was written and directed by Clive Barker called Nightbreed. Unlike Hellraiser, which Clive Barker also wrote and directed, whenever Nightbreed came out it got kind of bad reviews, it got mixed reviews. I haven't seen the movie, but it's well documented that it had a lot of studio interference and a lot of studio meddling, and so I think that's probably the reason why it was unsuccessful, despite the fact that they were planning out an entire series for it. But also, I think more than that, I think it was just kind of built on a shaky foundation. The story goes that Clive Barker wrote this novel, Cabal, and then he realized that it would be a really good fit to make into a movie. But I do have to question that. I have to question if maybe he was writing this novel in preparation for the movie. What I mean by that is that whenever he did Hellraiser, he had trouble getting Hellraiser funded, and so as a result, he wrote The Hellbound Heart. And then people liked The Hellbound Heart, and so he was able to get enough funding to turn it into a movie, Hellraiser. And so as a result, I have to wonder if maybe that was the reason why this novel was written, is it was written as a way to get funding for the movie. And usually that's not how things go. Usually you have a book and it's successful, and then there are separate people who decide to turn it into a movie. It's actually quite rare that adaptations of books or novels are done by the same people who wrote those initial books or novels. But Clive Barker is something of a polymath. He's a writer and he's an artist and he's a director. And at the time in the 80s, he would have been a very successful writer, and so I have to wonder if maybe he was just using his writing as a way to achieve success in cinema. But regardless, this is a video on the book Cabal, not the movie that came after it. There are 3 different covers I've seen for this book. There is the original American cover, which features a close-up of an eye in a town. There's a second cover, which just features a picture of a bearded man. And then there's a third cover that kind of reminds me of Saw. It reminds me of Jigsaw the puppet. And I'm not gonna lie, I think all these covers do a very bad job of depicting what the book actually is about. Because really, this book is Clive Barker's take on vampires and werewolves. But as I said, I think part of the reason why the movie adaptation of it was unsuccessful was because it was built on a shaky foundation, and this book is that shaky foundation. It's an interesting read, but it has a lot of problems and there are weird things about it, and as I've said before, I think it's more interesting to talk about works that are flawed than works that are just straight masterpieces. And I think there's just as much to learn from failures as there is from successes. And I want to make this clear, I don't think this book is a failure. I actually really enjoyed it. More than anything, I think I found this book odd in ways that it maybe didn't intend to be. Clive Barker, I think, is one of those people whose name is well known, but at the same time, he's not big like he would have been in the 80s and 90s. 20 or 30 years ago, his name actually carried some weight. There were video games with his name in the title. There were different comic book adaptations of his work and continuations that used his name. But at this point in time, in the year of our Lord 2025, I think that he's definitely fallen off. And it's kind of sad, actually, what's happened. So for a very quick and brief background, Clive Barker wrote a bunch of plays in the 70s and early 80s. It was in the mid 80s whenever he achieved some sort of success with his Books of Blood series, which are a collection of really fantastic horror stories. There are 30 stories across 6 volumes in the Books of Blood series, and not all of them are hits. There are a few stories that I think are just outright bad, but I do think on the whole there are more hits than misses. Clive Barker has always had a unique voice. He has always had a unique writing style that sounds like him, and honestly I think he's just a much better wordsmith and writer as a whole than a lot of other writers. So the 80s were a very big decade for him. He did the Books of Blood, he did the Hellbound Heart, he wrote and directed the first Hellraiser movie, he wrote the Damnation game. As I said, he wrote this novel Cabal. In the 90s and early 2000s, it feels like his work started to stray more into fantasy than horror, and then he's struggled with a lot of health issues for the last like 10 or 15 years, and so as a result he has not been very productive on the writing front, which is a shame because I think he's supremely talented. And so as a result, I feel like most people in my generation probably don't know Clive Barker. If you're an older millennial or a Gen Xer, or if you're really into horror writing, then you probably know him. And I do think that part of that is because of the fact that his attention started to become more drawn towards movies. He's written and directed and produced some movies, but again, I do think that his career just sort of fell off to where the only recognizable thing that he's done at this point in time would be Hellraiser and Pinhead. And I just think it's kind of sad because I think that he's a really talented writer who's written a bunch of fantastic stories, but I think that sometimes his ideas can just be too big, which brings us to Cabal. So as I said, I have enjoyed Cabal, but I think it definitely has flaws. For starters, I think the premise of it is just kind of ludicrous, and this is very much one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about it, because it has just an insane premise with too much going on. Basically, the story kind of starts off with a conversation between Decker, a therapist, and Boone, his patient. Boone has some kind of mental disorder that's not really gone into, and Decker accuses Boone of committing a series of 15 serial killings. Boone rejects this and is like, what? I didn't kill all these people. And Decker's like, yeah, you killed all these people. Decker forces Boone to study all these different photos from crime scenes, and over a series of weeks and months, Boone just kind of accepts that he did kill 15 people and just didn't remember it because he entered some kind of fugue state because of his undisclosed mental illness. Following this, Boone tries to take his own life by jumping in front of a car. It makes me think of the Smiths song, "And if a double-decker bus crashes into us, to die by your side while the pleasure is mine." Sounds like Dracula, not Morrissey. So Boone survives the suicide attempt and he finds himself in a hospital, at which point a man named Narcissi shows up. And while Boone is in the hospital bed, Narcissi tells him about the city, Midian. And Narcissi, that doesn't sound right to me, Narcissi, but I don't know how to say it. But anyway, this guy tells Boone about this magical city where they accept outsiders, and he believes that Boone was someone sent to test him because this guy has wanted to go to Midian for a long time. And so this guy tells Boone how to get to Midian, and then he cuts off his own face to show that he can join the city because he's a weird outsider. And so then Boone escapes. Boone makes a huge long journey across Canada to go to the city. And then whenever he's there, there are two guys who he meets, and they both transform, and one of them tries to eat him, and he gets away. And so after Boone gets bit, Decker, the therapist, shows up with a bunch of cops. Decker has gone to the police and said that Boone is a serial killer and that he's killed 15 people. And so the cops want to capture Boone, but Decker is able to get Boone alone for a minute to try to convince him to come out of hiding and give himself up to the cops. And then Decker tells Boone that Boone didn't kill all those people, Decker did. Basically, Decker, the therapist, is just a serial killer who wears a mask and is crazy, and he goes around killing people. And so he's framed all these killings on Boone, and then his next plan is to go and kill more people and then find someone else to frame for those killings. Which seems kind of crazy, it seems kind of ludicrous. But anyway, Decker says that Boone is attacking him, and then the cops shoot up Boone. Boone has a girlfriend who he left behind and who comes after him. She shows up at the city of Midian and finds out that Boone was shot down there, but she refuses to believe that he was actually a serial killer because that's crazy. While she is there, she is able to find some of the people who are able to transform, the nightbreed as they call themselves. And you see the nightbreed, who are essentially Clive Barker's take on vampires and werewolves, as I said. They're people who can transform, and they are monsters, and also they eat human flesh, but they have this nice little civilization going on underneath the cemetery. So the girlfriend connects with the nightbreed, and she figures out that Decker is actually the serial killer whenever he tries to kill her. And by then it's been revealed that Boone is alive, because what happened, you see, is that he was bitten right before he was shot down by the police. And so the police killed him, but also it caused him to be brought back to life as a nightbreed. And so my understanding is that he's able to transform into a werewolf at will. Whenever she's in Midian, the girlfriend is chased by Decker, and Boone at the time is with the nightbreed who've taken him in. But since he's gained the powers to transform, he's able to hear the struggle going on above him. He's able to hear his girlfriend being chased by a serial killer. And so the nightbreed tell Boone to not go up there and to let her die, essentially, because if he goes and saves her, then their entire presence will be revealed to everyone. But he doesn't listen, and he goes up and saves his girlfriend, and the doctor gets away. And so the doctor knows about the city of Midian now. The girlfriend has been staying at a hotel, and so she is able to find Boone and take him back to the hotel, but it turns out that Decker has been there because he knew that she would be there, and Decker killed literally everyone except for a baby. And again, he's framing Boone. And so now everyone believes that Boone massacred this entire hotel. And it didn't help that whenever the police found him, he was covered in blood because he started transforming into a werewolf and eating one of the human bodies. Decker is able to convince the police, including a corrupt police chief, to go back to Midian. Decker tells the police basically that there are all these psychos in Midian under the ground living in the cemetery who are aiding Boone. And so all the cops show up at Midian, and then they start killing all the nightbreed. After Boone gets arrested, he's taken to jail where his girlfriend is then able to break him out. They go to Midian, there's a big final battle. The city of Midian is actually being run by a character called Baphomet, named after the demon. And I really love the depiction of this character because Baphomet is described as existing in a cold flame as just a bunch of chunks of meat. And I'm going through it really quickly, but basically there's a battle, the doctor dies, he gets killed by Boone, who it transforms into a werewolf and kills the crap out of him. The city of Midian gets destroyed, all the nightbreed scatter, and Boone is given the responsibility by Baphomet to create a new city for the nightbreed. He's also given a new name by Baphomet, Cabal, where the name of the book comes from. And so then it's Boone's responsibility to rebuild the city that essentially he kind of destroyed because he caused the doctor to find out about it, and then the doctor sent cops. And so at the end, Boone is with his girlfriend, and he tells her that he's going places that she can't follow because she's a human and he's a nightbreed. But she loves him and wants to be with him, and so she stabs herself and kills herself, and he has to bite her, thus bringing her back to life as a nightbreed. And then together, the two of them go off, and they're going to rebuild the city. And so oddly enough, it's kind of a happy ending. Now, the reason why I wanted to talk about this book is because the premise of it is just kind of ludicrous. Shockingly enough, I think the most unbelievable aspect of it is not the vampire werewolf type nightbreed creatures, but rather just the idea of a therapist who is a serial killer and wears a mask going around murdering people, who is able to convince one of his patients that the patient is actually responsible for 15 murders. I feel like that plot line doesn't link up properly to the city of Midian, and I read the summary for the Nightbreed movie, and it turns out that they made more of a connection between the two. Because as it stands, it feels like you just have a serial killer plot line, which could have been its own novel, and then you have the Midian Nightbreed plotline. And I understand Clive Barker wanting to mash these two ideas together because, again, as I was saying, it's kind of his take on a werewolf vampire story, but also it's his take on a thriller because you have the serial killer murderer aspect of it. And so it feels like the story should have had more of a psychological bent to it because of that, but at the same time, it has the, entire vampire werewolf creature of the night thing going on, so you have a lot of gore and fighting. And I understand what Clive Barker was trying to do because he was actually trying to do something really interesting with this. Because he said that he's always loved monsters, as have I, but the issue is that oftentimes whenever you have a people versus monsters story, the monsters are dumbed down a little bit. Oftentimes, if you have stories like that where you're trying to root for the monsters, what people will do is they'll make the monsters appear nicer and say, oh no, monsters aren't bad guys, they're actually good and they're just trying to live on their own. You can see that if you look at the recent Devil May Cry anime. In that show, they take the demons and they say, oh no, they're not evil creatures or anything, they're just people trying to live on their own who are being oppressed. And really, it's the humans who are the bad ones because the humans are evil and they're trying to conquer the demons, and so the humans are the real bad guys, but the demons are actually good. And so Clive Barker twisted it a little bit because he wanted to do humans versus monsters story, but he didn't want the monsters to lose any of their ferocity or any of their beastly nature. And so the Nightbreed in this are fierce and they're violent. In Boone, whenever he's able to transform into one of the Nightbreed creatures, he's able to eat people. But in order to make that look better, then you have to have like a serial killer, and you have to have evil people, and you have to have corrupt priests and corrupt police chiefs. And so I think I appreciate what he was trying to do, but it just doesn't come together. It doesn't fit together the way that I think it needs to. There are a lot of really cool things about it. There are a lot of really cool ideas and descriptions. I love the way that Baphomet is presented, as I said. There's a priest character that kind of turns into One by Metallica at the end, except he's still able to like talk and hear, but he's blind and he loses his limbs. But he's able to see visions, and while he is still human, he seems to want to follow the Nightbreed. And so you have the corrupt police chief who takes the priest home and who is going to take the priest with him anywhere he goes. Because the priest, since he's able to see visions, he knows where the Nightbreed are. The police chief says that he wants to join the Nightbreed, but really that's not the case because he wants to kill them all. And so you have kind of that interesting aspect of it that's just kind of left off. It's just kind of there at the end. And so the book strikes me as something that's being set up to be the first in a series, but that was never the case. And so I think that's sad and disappointing because of the fact that there are some interesting ideas here that I would love to see followed up on. But as I've said, I feel like the very foundation of this book is somewhat shaky. I feel like just that initial premise of there being a serial killer and then there being vampire werewolf type creatures, the Nightbreed, I feel like it's just kind of big and too much, and I feel like the two things don't connect all that well. And it feels like too much of it is just kind of driven by chance. Like in the first place, there isn't any real reason why Decker is trying to convince Boone specifically that Boone is the one that committed the murders, other than Boone has the mental issues. And then in the same vein, it doesn't feel like there's any reason why Narcissi, the guy who cuts off his own face, why he tells Boone about Midian. And so it feels like there's just kind of a lot of chance. It feels like the things are only tangentially connected. And as I said, I read the summary page of the movie on Wikipedia, and it sounds like there were some changes made to the plot to tie things more closely together. But as it stands, it just kind of feels disconnected in some ways. In other words, it feels like there were a lot of really cool ideas here that weren't properly tied together and connected. I think you can make it work, and as I said, I think it's a really interesting dynamic to have the monsters be ferocious, but also you have a serial killer to represent the ferocity of humans. but as it stands, it just doesn't really fit together all that well. So I wanted to talk about this novel just because I have never heard anyone talk about it. And again, even though it's imperfect, even though it's deeply imperfect, I think I still really enjoyed it, and I still think it's interesting, and I think that there is still something to learn from it. A lot of Clive Barker's descriptions in his other work are really gory, and that's the case here. And it's great because he's super creative. All in all, in spite of its flaws, I still really enjoyed this story. And like I said, I kind of wish there was a follow-up to it. So this is what I got. This is my video on Cabal by Clive Barker. Thank you for watching. Have a nice night, and goodbye.